My son brought a psychiatrist to declare me incompetent. He didn't know that this doctor was my ex-husband and his father. Before we begin, my dear subscribers, I kindly ask you to share your opinion about this channel in the comments. What you like, what you don't. And please, write which city and country you're watching me from. This will help me find stories from the places where your hearts are. Atlanta mornings have a certain weight to them in the fall. The kind of air that feels like it's carrying all the unfinished conversations of summer. That day, I was sitting at my kitchen table, a mug of chicory coffee cupped between my palms, staring at the sunlight spilling across the hardwood floors of the house I'd lived in for nearly half a century. This big brick home on the outskirts of the city was where I had raised my only son, Marcus. It had held his first steps, his first heartbreak, and too many holiday dinners to count. My husband, Harold, had been gone for many years. The silence he left behind had become something I'd learned to live with, like an old scar that no longer aches but still catches the light. I'd grown used to that quiet, even treasured it. But that morning, the quiet didn't last. A sharp knock rattled the front door, quick and impatient. Then a voice. My son's voice, louder than it needed to be. "Mama, open up. It's me, and I'm not alone." Those words didn't sit right. Marcus had never been the type to announce himself like a police officer serving a warrant. My gut tightened. I pushed myself up from the table, the floor cool under my bare feet, and crossed the foyer. When I opened the door, Marcus stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing the same cautious smile he used when he had bad news to deliver. Beside him was a tall, silver-haired man in a long camel coat, the kind of coat that smells faintly of expensive cologne and dry cleaning. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and wore a practiced expression of polite detachment. "Mama," Marcus said, "this is Dr. David Brown. He's a psychiatrist. He just wants to talk to you, help you out a bit. I've been worried about you." For a moment, the name didn't register. But when I looked into the man's eyes, deep, steel gray, steady as a locked gate, my heart dropped straight through the floor. David, not Dr. Brown, not to me. David was my first husband, the man I'd once loved enough to imagine forever with, until the day he left me, 40 years ago, and never came back. He was also the father Marcus had never met, the truth I had carried like a stone in my chest all these years. He didn't flinch, didn't let on that he knew me, just gave the kind of professional nod you might give a stranger whose file you've read but never met. That almost hurt more than if he'd shown shock. I stepped back to let them in, my mind racing. Marcus wasted no time. He sat across from me at the kitchen table while David, I couldn't bring myself to call him doctor, sat beside him, briefcase on his lap like a gavel waiting to drop. "Mama, I think you've been struggling," Marcus began in that careful tone people use when they've already decided what's wrong with you. "You don't want to sell the house even though it's too big for you now. You've been talking to Dad." He stopped, corrected himself, "to Harold. Like he's still here. You hardly see anyone. It's not healthy." He was listing my so-called symptoms like he was reading from a chart, as though I were an object, not his mother. David sat silently, eyes flicking between us, only breaking in to ask the occasional, "And how often does that happen?" Or, "Would you say you feel isolated most days?" His voice was low, smooth, professional, and utterly cold. It didn't take me long to understand what this was. Marcus had brought his own father, unknowingly, into my home under the title of psychiatrist to assess me. And if they could get me labeled incapable of managing myself, the house, my house, would be out of my hands before the year was over. The irony burned. So I decided right then that if they wanted to play a game, I'd play it better. I answered each question with a calm precision that belied the heat building in my chest. When David asked, "What does betrayal mean to you?" I met his eyes without blinking and said, "Sometimes a man goes out to buy bread and never comes back. And sometimes he comes back 40 years later to take the last thing you have left." For the first time, I saw something flicker behind his controlled expression. Not recognition exactly, but a crack in the armor. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly eager to wrap things up. They left with the promise that I'd think about moving into a small studio apartment. I saw them to the door with a smile that didn't reach my eyes, but inside me, something had clicked into place. Enough. By the next morning, I had an appointment booked at Harmony of Mind, the private clinic listed on David's card. I'd used my maiden name. If he could play roles, so could I. The clinic sat in one of those polished glass buildings near Midtown, the kind that always looks like it was built yesterday and costs more per month than most people make in a year. Harmony of Mind. The name was etched into a frosted panel by the elevator doors, a font so smooth it felt like it was already trying to talk me into trusting it. I dressed with care that morning. A navy skirt suit I hadn't worn in years, my mother's pearl brooch pinned neatly to the lapel. My hair smoothed back, lipstick in a color I called "Don't Try Me." If I was going to walk into the lion's den, I wasn't going in looking like prey. The receptionist smiled, that professional smile people use when they're trained to be nice without actually knowing if they like you. "Good morning, ma'am. Do you have an appointment?" "Yes," I said, giving her my maiden name, the one David had last heard from my lips decades ago. 10 o'clock with Dr. Brown." She tapped at her computer, then nodded. "You can have a seat. He'll be with you shortly." The waiting area was all beige and chrome, the air tinged with something floral and expensive. I sat down in one of the leather chairs, crossing my legs, scanning the room. Every magazine on the side table was neatly stacked, dated within the last 2 months. Everything here was curated, controlled, the kind of place where you weren't supposed to see the seams. When David stepped into the doorway, he looked exactly as he had the day before. The same perfectly pressed suit, the same calm, cool expression, but his eyes flickered just for a second when the receptionist handed him my file. "Miss Carter," he said, reading my maiden name aloud. He gestured toward the hall. "Right this way." His office was exactly what I'd expected. Tasteful, understated, designed to make you feel safe enough to spill your guts, but still aware of who held the upper hand. A framed degree on one wall, shelves lined with books that were probably for show, and a window with a skyline view that made Atlanta look almost peaceful. He closed the door behind me, motioning toward the armchair opposite his desk. "So, what brings you in today?" I took my time sitting down, smoothing my skirt. "A case," I said simply. "One I think you'll find interesting." One of his eyebrows lifted. "Go on." I leaned back, crossing my legs. "It's about a young man. Grew up without a father. His mother was left pregnant, abandoned, raised him alone, did her best, gave him everything. And then, decades later, this young man hires a psychiatrist to help him declare his mother incapable of managing her own affairs, so he can take her home." David's expression didn't change much, but I've known him long enough, or I did once, to see the small tell. The slight tension at the corner of his jaw. "And the psychiatrist," I continued, "just happens to be the same man who left the mother all those years ago, who never knew the boy was his own son." Silence stretched between us, heavy as lead. He set his pen down slowly, folding his hands on the desk. "That's quite a story." "It is," I agreed, "and it's not hypothetical." The air in the room shifted then, subtle but sharp. His professional mask stayed in place, but the eyes, those eyes, were beginning to betray him. And that's when the door opened. Marcus stepped in, all energy and bright certainty. "Hey, Doc, thought I'd catch you before." He stopped, his gaze flicking between us. The color drained from his face as realization took hold. I didn't give either of them time to gather themselves. I stood, smoothed my skirt again, and looked my son square in the eye. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady, "meet your father." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Marcus's lips parted, but no sound came out. His gaze shifted to David, whose face had gone pale under his careful grooming. "You knew?" Marcus's voice was hoarse. "You knew this whole time?" David opened his mouth, but I was already moving toward the door. "I'll leave you gentlemen to discuss it," I said. And with that I walked out, heels clicking against the polished floor, heart pounding not from fear, but from the clean, cold satisfaction of finally putting the truth where it belonged. Outside, the sky was a bright, unflinching blue. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing it in. For 40 years I'd carried the weight of what he'd done. And now, I'd set it right at his own desk. But even then, I knew this wasn't the end. Marcus had questions, David had ghosts, and I had decisions to make about what came next. 6 months can pass like a blink or like a slow march, depending on what's weighing on you. For me, they passed with the deliberate rhythm of someone learning to breathe again. The house, that big red brick monument to my life in Atlanta, didn't feel like home anymore after that day in David's office. The walls that had once heard Marcus's laughter, the kitchen that had held every Christmas roast I ever made, they felt poisoned. Every creak in the floorboards reminded me that my son had stood in this foyer and plotted my removal. So I sold it. I didn't wait for a bidding war. I wanted it gone like you want a splinter out of your hand, quick and clean before it festers. The papers were signed in April, and by May I was moving into a small white house just outside the city with a porch swing and a yard big enough for the garden I'd been dreaming about since Harold died. It smelled like earth and lilacs instead of lemon cleaner and resentment. David hadn't called after the day in his office. Not at first. Then, about 3 weeks later, I got a short, careful message. "If you're willing, I'd like to talk about the past." No, I'm sorry. No excuses. Just that. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, but it can also be a kind of bravery. I agreed to meet him. We sat on my new porch that afternoon, the air thick with the scent of tomato vines and the distant hum of cicadas. He didn't try to charm me, which was wise. He just started talking about how he was young and scared when he left, how he convinced himself I'd be better off without him, even though he knew it was a lie. How the years turned that lie into something he could almost believe, until Marcus walked into his office, asking for help, with his mother. He didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer it, not that day, but he started showing up. Not every day, not even every week, just often enough to make himself useful without pushing too far. Fixing a squeaky gate hinge, dropping off fresh peaches from a farmer he knew, sitting on the porch swing with a glass of sweet tea in a silence that didn't demand to be filled. It was strange seeing him as an older man, stripped of the sharp arrogance he'd worn like a suit when we were young. Strange, too, how time had softened certain angles but left others just as jagged. Marcus, meanwhile, was unraveling. The first call came in late June. "Mama," his voice cracked the way it did when he was a boy with a scraped knee. "She's gone. She left me. I didn't ask who." I knew, Kayla had finally decided she didn't need him. According to Marcus, she'd called him a monster before walking out the door with a single suitcase and the keys to her new apartment. In the months that followed, his calls became frequent. Sometimes they were apologies, pouring out in the middle of the night. Sometimes they were just the sound of him breathing on the other end, as if hearing me pick up was enough. "I didn't know," he said once, his voice raw. "If I'd known, if you'd told me he was my father." I stopped him there. "Marcus, knowing wouldn't have changed the truth about what you did. And the truth is, you tried to take something from me that wasn't yours to take." There would be more to say. I could feel it building, like the swell before a storm. But I wasn't ready to have that reckoning until I knew he was ready to hear it. For now, I tended my garden. I let David sit on the porch sometimes. I listened when Marcus called. And I waited. Because I knew the day was coming when my son would finally ask the one question he was most afraid of. The question came on a Sunday evening, when the sun was folding itself behind the trees and the air smelled like rain that hadn't yet fallen. I was sitting on my porch swing, a glass of iced tea sweating on the small table beside me, watching the sky turn the color of bruised peaches. The cicadas were loud enough to fill the quiet between my thoughts. Marcus's name lit up my phone. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen. His calls had become a kind of roulette, sometimes soft and sheepish, sometimes tight with guilt, sometimes just silence. Tonight his voice was low but steady. "Mama, can I come by?" Something in me braced. "You can." It took him 40 minutes to get there, long enough for me to set out another glass, long enough for me to wonder if he'd turn around halfway. When his truck pulled into the driveway, he sat there for a good minute before stepping out, like he was practicing the conversation in his head. He walked up the porch steps slower than usual. His shoulders, once squared like a soldier's, were slightly hunched. The boy who used to bound into my arms after school was gone. This was a man learning how to approach his own mother again. "Nice garden," he said, eyes flicking to the neat rows of tomatoes and beans. "It's honest work," I replied. "Plants don't lie to you. You feed them, they feed you back." He gave a short, humorless laugh and sat across from me. The space between us was filled with the soft groan of the porch swing and the far-off barking of a neighbor's dog. For a while he didn't speak, just traced the rim of his glass with one finger, eyes on the boards beneath his feet. Then he looked up. "Mama," he said, voice rough, "do you think you'll ever be able to forgive me?" The words landed like a stone in a still pond. I felt the ripple of them move through my chest, carrying 4 decades of silence about his father, 6 months of anger over his betrayal, and all the love and disappointment that comes from raising a child who's old enough to wound you but still somehow yours. I didn't answer right away. Forgiveness isn't something you keep in a drawer, ready to hand over when someone asks. It's a thing that grows, if it grows at all, in its own time, in its own way. "You're asking me for something I can't give you yet," I said finally. "Maybe I never will. Forgiveness. It's not the same as forgetting. And I can't forget how quick you were to believe I was a burden you needed to be rid of." His face tightened, but he didn't look away. "I thought I was helping. I thought—" "You thought wrong," I cut in, but gently. "You listened to the voice that told you my worth was tied to the square footage of my home and the number of conversations I have in a week. You listened to someone who wanted me smaller, quieter, and you didn't stop to think about what that would do to me." He swallowed hard. "I was scared. About you being alone. About losing you the way I lost Dad." "You didn't lose your father," I said, my voice steady. He left. There's a difference. And maybe if you'd known that sooner, you'd have seen how dangerous it is to treat people like pieces you can move off the board when it suits you. The porch light flickered on automatically as the sky darkened, casting a warm halo over his face. He looked older in that light, like the weight of the past half year had carved something deeper into him. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time it didn't sound like he was trying to buy my forgiveness. It sounded like he was naming a truth he'd been afraid to face. I nodded once. "I hear you." That was all. No embrace, no dramatic reconciliation. Just the space between us shifting slightly, the smallest tilt towards something that might one day be mended. After he left, I stayed on the porch, listening to the night settle in. The moon climbed over the trees, silvering the garden rows. I thought about how plants recover from a storm. They don't pretend it didn't happen, they just keep reaching for the light, and I wondered if that's what Marcus and I were doing now. By August, the Georgia heat was the kind that pressed on you from the inside like the air itself had weight. The cicadas screamed from the pines and the asphalt shimmered in waves. My little white house on the edge of the city was holding up just fine, but I could feel the past circling like a hawk, sometimes near enough to cast a shadow, sometimes just a dot in the distance. Marcus had been visiting more often, though never without the careful pause at the gate as if he was still asking permission. Each visit carried a quiet apology tucked into its edges, a fixed screen door, a bag of groceries left on the counter, a jar of honey from a roadside stand. The things he did were small but deliberate, as if he'd figured out that trust wasn't something you could buy back in one grand gesture, but something you paid for in installments. One Saturday afternoon, I was on the porch, trimming dead leaves from the potted geraniums when his truck pulled in. This time he wasn't alone. David stepped out of the passenger side. He looked older than I remembered from the clinic. Not in years, but in the way a man does when he's been carrying something heavy for too long. His posture was straighter, but there was a hesitation in his steps, like he wasn't sure the ground here would hold him. "Mama," Marcus began, his voice careful. "We thought, maybe it's time we all talked." My first instinct was to tell them both to turn around and take their unfinished business back down the driveway. But the thing about age is, you learn the difference between what you want to do and what will actually help you sleep at night. I put down my shears and nodded toward the porch chairs. David sat opposite me, Marcus between us like a buffer. For a moment, none of us spoke. The breeze rattled the wind chimes, carrying the faint scent of honeysuckle. "I should have told you the day you walked into my office," David said finally, his voice low. "I knew you the moment I saw you. I just didn't know how to undo 40 years in one breath." I studied his face. "You didn't need to undo 40 years. You just needed to start by telling the truth." Marcus looked between us, his brow furrowed. "So, you both knew that day?" "I knew who he was," I said. "He knew what he'd done." David flinched but didn't argue. "Marcus, I left your mother before I even knew she was pregnant. It wasn't right. It wasn't brave. I told myself a lot of lies about why it happened, but none of them changed the fact that I wasn't there. Not for her, not for you." Marcus leaned back, his hands clasped between his knees. "All this time, I thought I was helping you, Mama, by bringing him in. I thought maybe you needed someone professional to tell you it was time to move on." "Move on?" I let the words sit for a moment. "Son, you can't move someone on from their life like they're a piece of furniture in the wrong room." The conversation drifted, slow but steady, into places we'd avoided for months. We spoke about the day at my house when Marcus had listed my so-called symptoms like a case file, about the clinic meeting, where truth had been dropped like a match in a dry field. And then, for the first time in decades, David and I spoke about the day he left. The rain, the half-packed suitcase, the note he didn't even sign. "I thought I was sparing you," he said, shaking his head. "But the truth is, I was sparing myself. And when Marcus came to me, I thought maybe I could at least help him, even if I couldn't fix what I'd broken with you." I didn't answer right away. There's a kind of silence that's heavier than words, and in that moment, it said more than any speech could. Marcus finally broke it. "So, where do we go from here?" I looked at him, then at David. "We go forward. That doesn't mean we forget, and it doesn't mean we pretend the ground behind us isn't littered with things we'll never get back. But it means we stop pretending the other person isn't in the room." David's gaze dropped to his hands, but I saw something loosen in his shoulders. Marcus nodded, a slow, thoughtful motion, like he was finally accepting that the road ahead wasn't going to be clean or quick. As the sun dipped low and painted the porch in amber, I realized we'd done something rare. Not forgiven, not reconciled, but broken the habit of silence. It wasn't peace, but it was the kind of uneasy truth you could plant something in, and I knew exactly which seed I'd be putting in the ground next. 2 weeks after that porch conversation, the air in my little white house felt different, not lighter exactly, but less stale, as if a few windows had been opened in a room that had been sealed for too long. Marcus stopped by twice, each visit unannounced but not unwelcome, carrying something from the farmer's market or hardware store. David came once on his own to return a book I hadn't asked for but didn't mind having back. Still, I could sense that what had been said on the porch was only the surface. There was something beneath it, thicker, darker, that Marcus was holding back. It came out on a rainy Tuesday evening. The clouds had been hanging low all day, heavy with the smell of wet asphalt, and by dinner time the rain was steady, drumming on the tin porch roof. I was in the kitchen pulling cornbread from the oven when headlights cut across the front windows. Marcus's truck. He came in without knocking, shaking the rain from his hair. He looked tired. Not the tired you get from a long day, but the kind that sits in your bones. "Smells good," he said, nodding toward the cornbread. I set it on the counter. "Sit, I'll fix you a plate." He didn't. He just stood there, watching me like he was trying to find the right place to drop something heavy. "Mama," he began, voice low, "I need to tell you why I did it." I met his eyes. "Then sit down and tell me." He lowered himself into the chair at the end of the table, the one Harold always used to take. The rain outside seemed to hush for a moment, as if the whole house was leaning in to listen. "I thought you were slipping," he said slowly. "Not crazy, just fading, talking to Dad's picture, keeping the house like it was still his. I thought maybe if you moved somewhere smaller, you'd, I don't know, start living again." "You thought uprooting me would help me grow," I said, not unkindly, "like a plant in the wrong pot." He nodded, staring at his hands. "But that's not all. Kayla, she made it sound worse. She kept saying it wasn't safe for you to be alone, that maybe you weren't handling your finances right. She pushed for me to act, and He stopped, exhaling hard. "I wanted to believe she cared about you, but really, she cared about the house." I leaned back, letting his words settle. "And so you brought in the one person who could sign the paper to take it from me." "I didn't know," he said quickly, "about him being my father. If I had—" I held up a hand. "If you had what? You think knowing that would have made betrayal feel better? Or worse. Marcus, the wound wasn't who you brought in. It was that you didn't trust me enough to talk to me before you acted. The rain picked up again, rattling the windows. He looked older in that moment, as if the past year had carved new lines into his face. "I'm sorry," he said again, but this time his voice cracked on the word. "Kayla's gone, took what she could and left, called me a monster. Maybe she's right." I shook my head slowly. "No, you're my son, and that means you're human. You did something wrong, deeply wrong, but that doesn't make you unworthy of trying to put it right." He swallowed hard. "Do you think there's any way back for us?" I studied him for a long moment. "There's no going back, Marcus. There's only forward. And whether we walk that road together depends on how much truth you're willing to carry." He nodded, eyes wet but steady. We didn't hug. We didn't have to. The space between us had shifted again, not healed but changed. As he left, I stood at the window watching his taillights disappear into the rain. Behind me, the kitchen still smelled of cornbread and butter, and I thought about how a house can hold both sweetness and bitterness at the same time. I knew the next step was coming, the one where I would decide exactly how I wanted my story with Marcus and David to end. And for the first time in a long while, I felt ready to write it myself. By the time September rolled in, the heat in Georgia had eased just enough for the mornings to feel almost gentle. I would sit on the porch with my coffee, watching the mist burn off the garden rows, and think about all the ground I'd covered in the past year. Not miles, but the kind of distance you measure in conversations, reckonings, and silences that have finally been broken. I decided I wasn't going to let this story end with me simply making peace in someone else's terms. Too many years of my life had been written by other people's choices. I was going to make the last chapter mine. The decision started to take shape on a Wednesday afternoon when David called. He didn't bother with small talk. "Marcus came by," he said. "We spoke. He's carrying a lot. But I think he's ready to hear you out, if you're ready to say what you need to." I looked at the notepad on my kitchen counter, the one where I'd been scribbling fragments of thoughts for months. Things I wanted Marcus to understand, truths I hadn't said out loud in decades. Some were raw enough to sting me just reading them back. Others were as simple as, "You cannot build your happiness on the ruins of someone else's life." "I'll talk to him," I said, "but it'll be on my ground." 2 days later, I called Marcus and told him to come by on Saturday morning. I didn't tell him David would be there too. I figured if we were going to put all the pieces on the table, we might as well have all the players in the room. Saturday came clear and bright, the air with that first whisper of autumn. I set out 3 chairs on the porch, the swing for me and the 2 wicker chairs opposite. The coffee was strong, the cornbread warm from the oven. I wanted the table between us to be as solid as my resolve. Marcus arrived first, looking uncertain but determined. He glanced at the extra chair, then at me. "You expecting someone?" Before I could answer, David's car pulled into the drive. He stepped out in a navy sweater instead of his usual tailored armor, carrying nothing but a hesitant expression. Marcus's eyes narrowed for a second, but he didn't get up. I motioned for them both to sit. "I asked you here," I began, "because this family's been living in fragments for too long. Marcus, you tried to solve a problem you didn't understand by taking something from me. David, you walked away from me before your son even took his first breath. Those choices have been living rent-free in my life for decades. That ends today." Marcus looked like he wanted to speak, but I held up a hand. "You'll both get your turn. First, you need to hear me." I told them everything I'd been holding. The years of raising Marcus alone, the sleepless nights wondering if I'd made the right choice not to tell him about his father, the hurt of seeing my own child doubt my ability to stand on my own 2 feet. I spoke about the day David left, the rain pooling on the front steps, the silence after the door closed. I spoke about the day Marcus showed up with his doctor and the cold realization that my son had brought my past to my door without knowing it. You both underestimated me, I said. You saw the parts you wanted to see, the parts that fit your idea of me. You forgot that I've been surviving without either of you for a long time, and you forgot that surviving teaches you exactly how to hold your ground. The porch was quiet except for the faint creak of the swing. David's face was unreadable, but Marcus's jaw worked like he was grinding down the urge to defend himself. Now, I said, leaning back, you can say what you need to say. Marcus went first. His voice was low but steady. I thought I was protecting you from loneliness, from, life getting too heavy. But I see now I was protecting myself. I didn't want to think about what would happen if you weren't here. I didn't want to see you as someone who could say no to me, and I'm sorry. David followed, his words slower. I left because I was afraid. Afraid I'd be a bad husband, a bad father. And in running from that, I became worse than I imagined. Meeting Marcus the way I did, it forced me to face all of it. I can't change what I did, but I can be here now, if you let me. I let their words sit in the air, weighed against the years they could never give back. This isn't about letting anyone in or shutting anyone out, I said. It's about making sure that if you're in my life, you're here as the men you are now, not the boys who made those choices. Neither argued. The coffee cooled between us. The cornbread went mostly untouched, but for the first time in years, the space between the 3 of us felt possible. Not healed, not whole, but no longer fractured beyond repair. I knew the final conversation was still ahead, the one where I'd give Marcus his answer about forgiveness, but this was the ground we'd needed to stand on before we could get there. The week after that porch meeting, the air had shifted, not in a way anyone else might notice. The traffic on the highway still roared, the neighbor's hound still barked at every passing squirrel, but I could feel it in my bones. The tension that had clung to me like damp linen for months was loosening. It was a Thursday evening when Marcus called. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. Mama, can I come over tomorrow? Just me this time. There was no question in my mind. Come by after lunch, I told him. Friday arrived, with a sky so blue it almost felt staged. The garden was heavy with late tomatoes, their skins splitting in the sun, and the bees were sluggish from heat. I set the porch swing cushions out and brewed a pitcher of sweet tea. If we were going to do this, if we were finally going to have the conversation hanging between us since that rainy Tuesday months ago, I wanted it to happen in the open air. Marcus's truck pulled into the drive right on time. He got out slower than usual, not because he was tired, but because you don't rush into something that matters. He had the look of a man who'd rehearsed 100 openings in his head and was about to throw them all away in favor of the truth. He sat across from me on the swing, elbows on his knees, looking down at his hands. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, about carrying the truth forward, about not pretending the ground behind us isn't littered. I've been trying to figure out if I deserve anything from you after what I did. I let him speak without interrupting. When I brought David to your house, I thought I was solving a problem, but really I was making myself the problem. I didn't trust you to know your own needs. And worse, I didn't see you as someone I could hurt. I thought you were too strong to be wounded by me. I was wrong. He finally looked up, his eyes searching mine. I can't undo it. I can't take back the way it must have felt. Your own son doubting you, trying to move you out of your life. But I need to know, will you ever forgive me? The question landed differently this time. He wasn't asking for relief from his guilt. He wasn't bargaining. He was just holding it out, raw, letting me decide if I wanted to pick it up. I took a slow sip of tea, the ice clinking in the glass, and thought about my answer. Marcus, I said, forgiveness isn't a switch. It's not something I can turn on because you've asked for it. It's something that grows, or it doesn't, depending on what you do from here. I can't promise I'll wake up one day and feel the slate is clean, but I can tell you this, I'm willing to walk forward with you and see what grows. His shoulders dropped just a fraction, but enough to show he'd heard what he needed. And understand this, I added, leaning forward. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean I'll stop expecting you to respect my boundaries, my choices, my life. If we're going to rebuild, it's going to be on ground that belongs to both of us, not just you. He nodded, eyes shining. I can do that. We sat for a long time after that, watching the light change over the yard. The bees disappeared back into their hives, and the air took on that first cool breath of evening. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated at the porch steps. Thank you for not shutting the door on me completely. I smiled, a small thing, but real. Doors stay open for those willing to knock the right way. As his truck pulled away, I knew the answer to his question wasn't sealed in stone. Not yet, but for the first time, it didn't feel like a wound that could only scar over. It felt like something that might heal, if tended. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of my forgiveness. The next turning point came sooner than I expected. It was the following Wednesday, and I was out back, weeding the rows of collards when I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel drive. I glanced up, expecting Marcus's familiar truck, but instead saw a silver sedan I knew belonged to David. He stepped out slowly, closing the door with more care than it needed. He had a paper bag from the bakery in one hand and a look on his face that told me this visit wasn't just about dropping off a few pastries. "Morning," he said, lingering by the gate. "Do you mind if I come in?" I wiped my hands on my apron. "Depends on what you've brought in that bag. If it's apology in the form of peach turnovers, you might get past the porch." That got a faint smile from him, but he stayed serious. Peach turnovers and a request. We sat on the porch, the bag between us. I poured him a cup of coffee without asking if he wanted one. After 40 years, you either know someone's habits or you don't bother trying. He cleared his throat. "I heard from Marcus that the two of you talked, that you didn't close the door." I raised an eyebrow. "I didn't open it all the way either." "I'm not asking you to," he said quickly, "but I am asking if you'd consider letting me do the same thing with you. Walk forward, see what grows." I've been in that office of mine for decades, listening to other people pick apart their regrets, their missed chances. I'm tired of being the man who didn't take his own advice. I leaned back in the swing, studying him. "You've got a lot more to answer for than Marcus does. He betrayed me once. You left me for a lifetime." "I know," David said. He didn't flinch from it. "And I know I can't make up for that, but I'd like to try to be in your life again, not as the man I was, not even as the man I thought I'd become, just as someone who can show up when he says he will." For a moment, the only sound was the wind chimes in the corner, catching a light breeze. I thought about all the years I'd spent wondering where he was, if he thought of me, if he'd regret the way he'd left. "David," I said slowly, You're not getting back the woman you left. She's gone. What's standing in front of you now is someone who learned to build her own walls, plant her own garden, and live in her own quiet. If you can respect that, then maybe you can have a seat at the table again. He nodded, as if he'd already prepared himself for that boundary. I can respect it. I poured him another coffee and slid the plate of turnovers between us. Then we'll see. But understand this. One step wrong and you'll find the door locked again. He accepted the cup with both hands, and for the first time since I'd opened that clinic door months ago, I saw something in his face that wasn't professional detachment or regret. It was relief. We didn't talk much more that morning. We ate the turnovers, drank the coffee, and let the breeze carry away what little was left to say, but in my mind, I was already thinking ahead to the next time all three of us might sit together, because if this new ground we'd stumbled onto was going to hold, it had to bear all our weight at once. And I intended to find out if it could. It was the first Saturday in October when I finally brought them both together. The air had turned crisp enough to warrant sweaters, and the maple at the end of my drive was just starting to blush red. I decided if there was ever a day to test whether new ground could hold all our weight, it was today. I called Marcus that morning. "Come for lunch," I said. "Bring nothing but yourself." Then I called David. 1 o'clock, and yes, Marcus will be here. There was a pause on the line, then a simple, "Understood." I spent the rest of the morning cooking. Collard greens simmered low with smoked turkey, cornbread golden in the cast iron, sweet potatoes roasting with cinnamon. Food isn't a solution, but it's a bridge, and I wanted that table to feel steady when we all sat down at it. Marcus arrived first, looking wary, but not resistant. He helped me set out the plates, glancing at the extra place setting, but saying nothing. When David's car crunched up the gravel, I saw Marcus's shoulders tighten. A reflex, not a choice. David stepped onto the porch carrying a basket. "Apples from the orchard," he said, setting them down. "Thought they might find their way into one of your pies." We all sat at the kitchen table. For the first few minutes, the only sounds were the clink of silverware and the occasional scrape of a chair. But food has a way of softening the edges. By the time the cornbread was passed around a second time, the silence had shifted from brittle to something that could hold words without breaking. I set down my fork and looked at them both. "I asked you here because I'm tired of holding separate conversations in my head. Whatever this family is now, it's not going to survive if we can't be in the same room without pretending the past isn't here with us." Marcus nodded slowly. "I know. And I know I've said it before, but I'm sorry to you, Mama. And to you," he added, glancing at David, "for not knowing what I was walking you into that day." David leaned back, hands folded. "And I'm sorry to you both for the day I left and for all the days I stayed gone. I can't undo them, but I can choose differently now." I let the words hang there for a moment. "Here's what I need from you, both of you. Show up when you say you will, when it's uncomfortable, when it's easier not to. I don't need grand gestures. I need consistency. That's the only thing that can rebuild what's been cracked." Marcus met my gaze. "I can do that." David's voice was quieter but steady. "So can I." We finished the meal without forcing conversation, letting the clink of plates and the hum of the fridge fill the gaps. When it was over, Marcus cleared the table and David washed the dishes. It was such a simple thing. Two men who had caused me the deepest hurt in my life standing shoulder to shoulder at my sink, but it was a sight I hadn't dared imagine. When they left, I stood on the porch, watching Marcus's truck lead David's car down the drive until both turned onto the road and disappeared. The yard was quiet again. the maple's red leaves catching the afternoon light. I thought about the first knock at my door months ago, the one that had shattered my quiet, about the clinic, about the garden I'd planted here in new soil, about the conversations we'd had and the ones still waiting. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't a door you threw open all at once. It was a gate you unlatched slowly, testing the hinges, listening for creaks, and maybe, just maybe, I was ready to open it a little wider. Because you can't always rebuild what's been broken, but sometimes you can plant something new right beside it and watch it grow.